And welcome everyone. I'm Shannon Dill. I'm with University of Maryland Extension. Welcome back to another Wednesday webinar. We're part of the Mid-Atlantic Women in Ag Network. To get started today, we'd first off like to thank our sponsors of the programs, as well as the collaborators on this. It's definitely a Mid-Atlantic effort in this project. Please use the chat pod if you have any questions throughout. And we're really excited to offer these the second and fourth Wednesday of each month. So they are recorded. You can see here in the blue link upcoming webinars as well as our archived webinars here at extension.umd.edu/women in ag. So with that, I am going to go ahead and turn today's session over to Sarah Hirsch. She'll be sharing her screen and going to be talking today about a really important topic, cover crop mixtures. So Sarah, if you want to share your screen here.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay, let's see, oops. Are you looking at my PowerPoint?
It's just a black screen right now.
Okay, let me try this again. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and try again. All right, I'm going to turn my video off. Hi, everyone. I'll just introduce myself. I'm an ag agent for University of Maryland Extension on the Lower Eastern Shore, and I'm going to turn my video off to try to hopefully keep my connection a little bit better. So I'm going to stop the video and let me try sharing again. Okay, let's try this. How does that look, Shannon?
That's great. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So I'm going to be talking, as Shannon said, about cover crop mixes, which is a topic that I really enjoy learning about and teaching about. So I'm looking forward to today. And this picture here is a cover crop mix of triticale, radish, and crimson clover. And that's one that I'll be talking a lot about kind of as a case study. Here's some more pictures of that 3 species mix. So the one on the left and on the right are both that cover crop mix of triticale, forage radish, and crimson clover. And those photos were taken in the fall. And then the one in the middle is that same mix that was taken in the spring. So you can really see that crimson clover taking off for this spring growth. So why would we want to plant a cover crop mix rather than just a monoculture or a single species of a cover crop? And so by planting a mix, we get more purposes. If you think about cover crops in terms of what purpose are you trying to fulfill, and then we can also include species with more functional groups and more seasonal niches. So that's what we see here in this photo. So the mixed species on the left has that crimson clover in it, and that's really taking off in the spring versus the single species. You can see in the spring that doesn't look nearly as, it's not as diverse and it's not fulfilling as many functions in the different seasons. Cover crop mixes can also allow us to have a more balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that gets into having available nitrogen for our crops to grow. So nitrogen is probably the most important nutrient, and it's the nutrient that tends to be most mobile, and we can lose it really easily. And so paying attention to that carbon to nitrogen ratio and having enough nitrogen in the system can improve your crop productivity. And then mixes can also allow you to have more adaptability to different factors in the environment. So site variability, seasonal variability based on your weather for a particular year, and then seed variability as well. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. And then most of today, we're going to really get into some of the implementation and the ideas behind how do you choose the cover crop species in your mix and some of the management considerations with that. So this is a diagram showing some of the purposes that cover crops can fulfill. And these are called cover crop benefits. I like to always put the caveat that these are potential benefits because you're never going to get all of these things when you plant a cover crop. So that's why it's really important to kind of think about it, draft it out on a piece of paper. What are you trying to achieve with your cover crop? What purpose do you have for that cover crop? And then that's a good place to start. And from there, you can start choosing what species and your cover crop that you want to plant. So, but a cover crop mix can allow you to have more benefits, more of these benefits than a single species cover crop. So I'm going to give an example here of that same 3 species mix that I had in the introductory slides. This is the triticale, and that triticale is really going to be doing a good job of adding organic matter into the system. So you can see this dark topsoil layer here and all of those roots and those fine roots up there. So a lot of that are the triticale roots. Then we have a forage radish in the mix, and you can see how deep these forage radish roots are. So that one is really achieving that purpose of biodrilling and scavenging deep soil nutrients, such as your nitrogen. That's going to be down, leaching down deeper in the soil, especially in the mid-Atlantic region, where you have a lot of rainfall and a lot of leaching occurring. And then this mix also contains the crimson clover, and that's a legume. So it's going to be actually adding nitrogen into the system. So it's fixing, it has a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria, and it's fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere and adding that nitrogen into your cropping system. So by having a mix, we really get those 3 different functions that are going to be happening in your cropping system. Back to this idea of seasonal niches. So we can see in the fall that the triticale and the forage radish are really dominating that mix. And the crimson clover is there, but it's not, it's a very small percent of the total biomass of that cover crop in the fall. But then in the spring, that crimson clover really takes off, and you can imagine how much nitrogen is being fixed or added into your system by having that crimson clover in the mix. And of course, the forage radish, that species is going to usually winter kill in a lot of regions of this country. And in Maryland, it typically winter kills. And so if you didn't have, if you just planted a monoculture or a single planting of that forage radish, you're only going to have the cover crop in the fall, and you're not going to have that cover and that there's living roots and all of the biomass in the spring. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the carbon to nitrogen ratios. And this basically just has to do with the availability of nitrogen for your crops, and that nitrogen is going to be coming from the cover crop. So if you have a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, such as this rye, very mature rye, that's going to have a lot of parts of carbon per part of nitrogen. So 82 carbons per 1 nitrogen. And this is going to result in very slow decomposition. And basically that nitrogen is going to be tied up and not available to be used by your crops. It's going to be tied up by the microbes. If you have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, such as the bottom arrow here, the hairy vetch, that only has 11 parts of carbon per 1 part of nitrogen. So this material is going to decompose much quicker, and that nitrogen is going to be available much sooner for the crop that you're trying to grow. And then if you look at kind of in between these two, so this rye cover crop in the vegetative stage, that has kind of an intermediate carbon to nitrogen ratio. Now I wanted to point out that the ideal microbial diet is about 24:1. So anything below that, so any carbon to nitrogen ratio below that is going to tend to have available nitrogen or release available nitrogen, and anything above that, the nitrogen is going to be tied up and not available. So if we think about this in terms of a cover crop mix, if we think about half of the pollinating rye and half of the early bloom vetch, so we combine those two species, now we're getting this carbon to nitrogen ratio in that ideal microbial diet range. And so that's sometimes we can kind of balance the carbon to nitrogen ratios of species by using a mix to be in that good range where we can ensure that we'll have available nitrogen for the next crop. Cover crop mixes can also lead to higher yields. So this was a study looking at 3 different cover crops, and then those cover crops were followed by a planting of corn, and the corn yield was analyzed. So the green dots here were a single species cover crop of a winter cereal. So this was something like rye or wheat that was planted alone. And the orange dots are a single species of radish, and then the blue squares are that mixed cover crop, and this was the radish, the cereal, and also the crimson clover that was mixed in there. So we can see that on the y-axis here, this is the corn yield, and we tended, and the x-axis is showing that carbon to nitrogen ratio again. So we tended to have higher yields when we had lower carbon to nitrogen ratios, which makes sense because that nitrogen would have been available for the corn. And the blue dots tended to do better than the green. So the green, which was the monoculture of cereal, tended to have lower corn yield following that cereal, and there was tended to be higher corn yield following that mixed species cover crop. The radish also did well in terms of corn yield, but then again, we want to think about all the functions. So if we are just planting a radish, we're not going to have that spring growth if that radish winter kills. So if we want to have multiple benefits and we want to have better corn yield, this study showed that the mix would be a really good option. One more kind of case study of some data showing some of the benefits of the cover crop mix. So this study was looking at the ability of a cover crop to do 2 things. We wanted the cover crop to scavenge deep soil nitrogen in the fall. So we wanted it to grow deep roots and get that nitrogen in the deep soil. But then we also wanted the cover crop to release that nitrogen in the spring for the following cash crop. So scavenge it in the fall and release it in the spring. And this graph is showing the soil depth on the y-axis. So this is the amount of soil nitrate from the surface layer all the way down. As we get down here, this is down to 7 feet deep. So this is the amount of nitrate in the soil in the spring from the surface layer down to 7 feet deep. And first, let's just look at the no cover crop control, which is the black line here. So when there was no cover crop planted in the spring, this is the amount of soil nitrate in the surface down to 7 feet deep. So when we had a cover crop, which are the colored lines, when we had a cover crop, no matter what the cover crop was, it did a nice job of cleaning up that deep soil nitrate. So the nitrate levels down in all of these deeper soil layers down to 7 feet deep were much lower in the spring compared to where there was no cover crop. So they all did a pretty nice job of scavenging that nitrate. And these are, again, the radish is the orange, the mixed species is the blue, and the winter cereals is the green line. So they all did a pretty good job of scavenging that nitrogen. But remember, the second purpose was that we wanted to scavenge it from the deep layers in the fall, but then we wanted to release it on the soil surface layer in the spring. And so if we look here, the radish and the mixed did a much better job of having available nitrate on the soil surface in the spring. And the winter cereal had much less available nitrate on the soil surface. Okay, so those are just kind of some case studies talking about how a mixed species cover crop can lead to more purposes and more benefits than a single species. And that was just a few case studies. There can be a lot if you're looking for a weed suppressor or for a pollinator. So there can be a lot of different functions that you're trying to achieve with your mixed species. But now I want to kind of shift gears and get more into the implementation of the cover crop and the management. So how do we, for example, choose what species to plant in a mix? And it can be pretty intimidating. So this is just a website I pulled up from a cover crop seed company called Green Cover Seed. And they literally have hundreds of different cover crop species and even varieties of those species on their webpage that you can order. So where do we start when we're looking to, we know, okay, we want to do a mix because it's going to have more purposes, but where do we start when we're trying to decide what mix is appropriate for us? So that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of today's webinar. So first, I always want to come back to this idea of make sure you figure out what are your goals and purposes. That's really where you have to start. So you don't want to just plant 3 species until you kind of decide what are you trying to achieve with the cover crop. And then also just as important is what are your management constraints? So what is your planting window? What crops are you growing and when is your land available to be put into a cover crop? Because that's going to be really a determining factor in what species and mixtures you should grow. So I'm going to talk about a few tools that can help you decide which cover crops are appropriate for you. And the one that I'm going to highlight that I like to use a lot actually comes out of Virginia. And I know we may have folks on today or who watch the webinar from other parts of the country. There's a lot of these tools developed in different regions. So if you're not from a place where it makes sense to use a Virginia tool, I'd recommend just reaching out to your extension agent or somebody near you, NRCS, and they can help you find a tool that's more appropriate for your region. But the one that I'm going to use as a case study is from Virginia, and you can get to this tool by going to Virginia, just Googling Virginia Cover Crop College 101. There's the website if you want to enter that, but I just find it easier to search that on Google. It's the first thing that comes up. The web page is going to look like this. It's a site from Virginia Tech. And what I'm going to be talking about is down here toward the bottom of the page. And we're going to be looking at this cover crop planting calendar and mix calculator. So it's just an Excel sheet. And it has several tabs on the bottom. And we're going to use a few of these tabs. The first one that I'm going to talk about is this A1 tab, Fall Seed Date Autofill. So basically what you see here is kind of we're first choosing our seasonal niche. So this Excel sheet breaks up the cover crops into the different seasons that you may be planting them. So the yellow up here is for a summer cover crop. The most typical cover crop, at least in the mid-Atlantic, are these niches 1 and 2, this blue section. So that's when you're planting a cover crop in the fall, following your summer cash crop, and you're letting that cover crop grow until planting in the spring. And then but there are other cover crops as well. So there's other situations or certain growers who may be looking for a cover crop during a different time of the year. So first you want to decide your seasonal niche, and then you want to think about your functional group. So we're going to look at the seasonal niche 1 and 2, the late fall to spring cover crop. And then it's broken up into these functional groups. So you see grass, and then brassica, forb, and legume. And so if you want to serve different functions, a lot of times folks will want to choose at least one species in each of these different functional groups. And then the third step would then be, so you know you want to plant a grass, a brassica, and a legume. The third step is then deciding which species among all of these legumes is going to be the best fit for you. So I like to break it down into there's 3 different stages. So what we're going to be doing here, basically on this spreadsheet, you enter in, the only thing you need to enter in is your average first freeze date. And you can find that on various websites. And so around our region, our average first freeze date that I found was October 20th. So I just entered that right here in the pink box. And then it's going to shift automatically, it's going to shift these dates up at the top. And these dates are showing you the planting date. And so I'm able to plant my cover crop on September 30th. And based on our average first freeze date, this is going to tell me what species are appropriate to be planted on that date. So this is really important. If you plant a species, like you can see here that a lot of these brassicas, you're too late to be planting those. And if you try to plant a forage radish or a forage turnip on September 30th in this region, this chart is telling you it's not going to perform very well. So it's not going to really have the function that you were hoping to achieve with it. So the 3 species that I'm going to choose are, so in this example, I would probably choose the rapeseed if I wanted to use a brassica. You can see there's a lot of choices for the grasses, and there's a lot of choices for the legumes. And then a few things that you want to keep in mind is the compatibility of the species. So we talked about, are the seeding dates compatible? You don't want to be planting at this time a mustard with maybe wheat because those seeding dates aren't compatible. Are the maturity and kill dates compatible? Think about what will happen in the spring. Are the growth habits and rates compatible? And so that gets into a little bit of your seeding rate, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So if something has a very competitive growth or a certain type of growth habit, then you may want to lower that rate of that species. And then think about how you're going to plant it. Are the seeding depths and methods compatible? If you're aerial seeding, there's certain species that are going to do better than others for aerial seeding. So we'll just use the same 3 species that we've been talking about. So we're going to pretend like we're growing a cover crop around mid-September, so maybe September 15th, and we're going to plant the triticale, forage radish, and crimson clover, since that's what I've been talking about a lot. So we know we want to plant forage radish, triticale, and crimson clover. The next question is what rate do we want those seeds to be planted at? And I forgot to mention, and so in kind of narrowing down your choice of the 3 species that you want to plant, so now we're getting back to this idea of the species within a functional group, there's a lot of tools available to help you narrow down those species. So before I talk about the rate for our 3 species that we choose, I'm going to just show you a few of these tools. One of them is on the same website, this Virginia Tech website. So it's the Virginia NRCS Cover Crop Planning Manual. And this can really help you decide among the species in that functional group. So if we're deciding between wheat, triticale, and rye, which are 3 very similar species, this will give you a description and kind of tell you what is the difference and which one would be appropriate for you. So it tells you, if we look at triticale, it's a cross between wheat and rye. And we can see that it's a little bit lower stature, so that may be something that you're interested in. And the spring residue is easier to manage, and so that may help you narrow it down among those species. This also has some really useful information about how this species will perform in a mix. So it tells you that forage radish is good in mixes, but be careful because it can outcompete the companion species. So this gets back to the growth habit and the competitiveness of the species. There are other tools. Again, I'm just using this Virginia one as a model, and it's one that I like a lot and I find helpful, but there's a lot of other tools out there. So very recently, the Northeast Cover Crop Council came out with a cover crop species selector tool. And this also has a tab where you can explore the different cover crop species. So this is the page that they have on forage radish, and it'll tell you all about forage radish and the characteristics. Has a lot of really nice photos. Kind of an older tool that's been around for a while, but I find extremely helpful, is this Managing Cover Crops Profitably book. And this is available for free online through SARE. And here's the website, but if you just Google Managing Cover Crops Profitably, it'll come up. And this has a lot of really useful charts in it. So here again, it's breaking it up by your functional groups. And then you can look at the ability that it has to do different functions. So if you're looking for a brassica and you're interested in that brassica scavenging nitrogen, you can see that the best choice would be the radish for that situation. So it has all different things that you may be interested in across the top: fighting weeds, good for grazing. It also has a table looking at the tolerances to different things that you may have in the environment. So heat, drought, shade, flood. So if you know that you have a field that's very prone to flooding and you want to plant a grass in that field, then you could see here that the annual ryegrass is going to do a lot better than wheat. So I would try to avoid wheat if that's your situation. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the seeding rate. So I'll just review. We've selected our season. We want to grow this cover crop we're going to plant it in mid-September, and we're going to let it grow until the spring. We've selected our functional groups. We want to include a grass, a legume, and a brassica. And then we've narrowed down our species to the point where we know we want to use triticale, radish, and crimson clover. So now we're going to go to that cover crop calendar and mix calculator again. And this time, instead of using the first tab, we're going to go over to this tab that's labeled C, Mix Rate Worksheet. And here, basically, we're going to decide our seeding rates by thinking about the fraction of base rate. And this is the idea that if our goal is to have a balanced mix of all of the functional groups, that some species are more competitive than others. So we want to take that into consideration. So we want to cut back on the rate of grasses and brassicas. And so we want to cut back on that rate to about half or less of what we would do in a monoculture or in a single species. But the legumes, they are not as competitive. So we want to keep that rate up pretty high. So they recommend 0.67 to the full rate for the legumes. And what we enter in here, you can change right up here, this little black box, you can change either to drill or broadcast. So I'm going to say we have a drill. So I change that. And then the only other thing you need to enter is in this pink column. I'm doing a 0.5 rate for triticale, a 0.25 for the radish, and 0.67 for the clover. And then it will populate with your pounds per acre that they recommend. And so this would be 55 pounds of triticale, 2 pounds per acre of radish, and 10 for the clover. Okay, so I'm going to do one other example. So the second example that I'm going to do is in this summer niche. And so this may be appropriate for a vegetable grower who either has a spring crop or a fall crop, some of the cooler season vegetables, but they have that summer window open. And so this can be a really great opportunity to build the soil or to get some benefits from having a quick summer cover crop in between maybe some cool season vegetables. So we're going to look at this niche 3 and 4. We're going to say that we're planting this cover crop on August 1st, and we'll let it grow into the fall. And again, we want to include a species from each of these functional groups. So a grass, a forb, and a legume. And so I decided to do pearl millet, black oil sunflower, and cowpea. So we've got one species in each of those functional groups. And how did I decide that? So I went back to that planting manual and I just read about the different species. And so here it said that pearl millet is good on droughty soil. So in my area, we tend to have pretty dry conditions that time of year, sandy soil, so they tend to lose a lot of water. So I was looking for some drought tolerant species. So these are good. They're all good on droughty soils, good heat and drought tolerance. Also, when I was reading about pearl millet, it said that it went well with cowpea. So some of the species will mix better than others with other species. And then I liked the fact that the sunflower was attractive for people and pollinators and wildlife. So that's kind of why I chose that species. In addition to it being drought tolerant and adaptable in mixes. Then we go back to our seeding rate calculator. So we got our species. We enter in, I did a 0.3 rate for the grass, a 0.5 rate for the forb or the sunflower, and then I did a full rate for the legume so it wouldn't get overpowered. And it told us our rates that we should plant 9, 5, and 80 pounds per acre. Okay, so that's a little bit about the tools that are out there and how you can narrow down your species based on your planting windows and the functions that you want. But we all know that sometimes, even if things are planted the same time one year to the next, that things can turn out very differently in agriculture. And so that's what we call the species expression. So I'm sure your radishes don't often look like this, but this guy somehow got a giant radish, and that could have to do with other factors out there, like your soil. You may have very good fertility. You may just have perfect weather that year. And so species, even if they're planted the same species or the same time, they can turn out differently. And this is an example of how different factors can affect your species expression. So these were 2 cover crop fields in Maryland. They had similar species, so they both contained the ryegrass, radish, and crimson clover. Oh, I'm sorry, the one was in Pennsylvania. So Lancaster County, PA, and Prince George's County, Maryland. So about an hour away from each other. They're not too far away from each other. There's 2 sites. So similar species were planted. There were a couple differences in these sites. First of all, the Prince George's County site had no history of manure. It was a pretty sandy soil, pretty low fertility. And the Lancaster County site had regular manure applications, and it was a very high fertility site. And also the Prince George's County was planted about a month later. So that was planted in early October, and Lancaster was planted in early September. And there were huge differences in how that cover crop turned out. So if we look at here, these values are showing the biomass of the cover crop, and also in parentheses is the pounds of nitrogen in that cover crop. So basically just the biomass times the percent of nitrogen in that biomass. So if we compare in November, that cover crop in Prince George's County was adding about 4 pounds of nitrogen. It took up about 4 pounds of nitrogen, whereas the cover crop in Lancaster had 200 pounds of nitrogen. So that's it, 4 versus 200. So a huge difference in how that cover crop performed and the function of that cover crop in terms of adding nitrogen to the system. And then again, those same pretty big differences still by the spring. So by the spring in Prince George's County, that cover crop had about 14 pounds of nitrogen versus in Lancaster, it had about 70 pounds of nitrogen. And so really you can plant the same cover crop, but it's going to result in very different benefits based on some of these other factors like planting date or site fertility. And there was a recent study done on this in Pennsylvania and New York. So this was on 8 farms in kind of that Northeast region. And they were looking at a 5-species mix of canola, which is a brassica, the Austrian winter pea, red clover, and crimson clover. So those are all legumes. And then the triticale, which is the grass. And they also found that how that cover crop expressed itself or performed was very different based on some of these environmental factors. So they found that if the site had high nitrogen and a lot of time to grow in the fall, then that canola, the brassica, tended to dominate the mixture. If it had low nitrogen, this favored the legume species. And that's not surprising. A lot of times the legumes are going to do very well comparatively in low nitrogen environments because they fix their own nitrogen. If there was a shorter growing season, that favored the triticale. And then while changes in the seeding rates, so they looked at all different seeding rates to see if that was going to greatly influence the cover crop. And while it did influence the cover crop to some extent, there was interactions with the growing degree days or the amount of time that that cover crop had to grow in order to determine the final expression of that mixture. So the seeding rate can make a difference, but it is sometimes overpowered and not even that important compared to some of these other factors in the environment or the length of time that that cover crop has to grow. And so they kind of summarized this study. They said when the soil nitrogen was high at the time of cover crop planting, then they had these highly competitive species dominating the mixture. So the grasses or the brassicas, and these could potentially decrease the services provided by the other species like the legumes, which are a weaker competitor. And then they found that early planting can even exacerbate this finding. So make the dominant species even more prevalent and the less competitive species less prevalent. So I wanted to ask this question. I've really been talking a lot about how great cover crop mixes are. And I wanted to ask, are cover crop mixes always the best? And the answer, I believe, to that would be no. So when you have a mix, that inherently means that you're going to have trade-offs. So they're not always going to be the best. And you really want to get back to always coming back to this idea, what is the purpose or the context of the cropping system? So I could think of an example where a mix may not be the best is if your purpose is to outcompete weeds, maybe after a corn crop prior to a soybean crop. So your main purpose of this cover crop is to compete with weeds. So the best cover crop in this case may just be a single species of something like rye, which is going to have a lot of biomass, and you can really get a nice mulch from that cover crop, and really it will do well to compete with the weeds. And so there would really be little benefit to adding a legume in that situation if your goal is to outcompete the weeds and the following crop is a legume itself, the soybean. So kind of in summary, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions here if you want to start entering anything in the chat box. But in summary, I want to come back to the idea of we really want to, number one, focus on the purpose and the functions and what we're trying to achieve with that cover crop, and also the practicality. So what are our management constraints? What's practical in my situation? So really think about this as something unique to your situation, your farm, your cropping system. What crops are you growing? So we really want to focus on that first, and then the diversity next. So I'm not a big proponent of planting 10 species mixes just to have 10 species out there. I'd rather think about a 3 species mix where each species really has a function and a purpose that you're trying to achieve with that species, and you're kind of catering the system to achieve that. And then you really want to start small and experiment, because we talked about how even the same species, they can really express themselves differently based on your chunk of land that you're on. So your fertility, the weather that you have, other factors that are unique to your land. And so it's really good to start small, try things out, see what works well where you are, and don't be afraid to fail, because we all know we can learn a lot from failing, and just try something, make a little change, or try something different the next time. So with that, I think here's my contact info. Feel free to reach out to me. If you'd like to rate my teaching, I'd appreciate that always. Here's the link to do that, and my email and work phone number. So let me see if I can pull up the chat. Any questions?
Yes, sir. There's a couple questions in here. One was about are native species used in cover crop mixtures?
That's a good question. I think that they can be, they could be, and I would have to review. I'm trying to think about what some native species, some examples of that, but I don't see why they couldn't be. I'd say most cover crops are not native, but there's certainly some native grasses and things out there that would work just fine as a cover crop. So I think, again, just coming back to the idea of whatever that native species, and there's certainly some flowers and good pollinators that could be really good at cover crops, and some of those may be good at scavenging nitrogen. So definitely just think about the native species and kind of the attributes of that species and what function that will have, whether it's a pollinator or a grass that's going to be adding a lot of fine roots and organic matter, and then just using those cover crops just like you would a non-native.
Great. The next question is, was the nitrogen from chemical fertilizers? So I think this was about 15 minutes into your presentation. I think it was the one when you were talking about the research studies.
Okay. So let me see if I can go back. Oh, it's not letting me go back. Okay. So if they were talking about was the nitrogen from the chemical fertilizers, the nitrogen that I was talking about in the soil, like at the different soil depths, I said that there were different amounts of nitrate following the different cover crops. So most of the sites did use chemical fertilizers, but this is just nitrogen in the soil. So that could come from organic matter breaking down or from the addition of organic fertilizers or chemical fertilizers. So any system, even those out in the forest or something never fertilized, any system is going to have nitrogen breaking down and that pool of nitrate in the soil. And so in our case, about maybe half of this would have been from chemical fertilizers and the other half just from that natural decomposition. If that doesn't answer the question, just feel free to chat follow up.
Great. The other question was about the name or links of the sites you mentioned for the various cover crop tools and deciding on the mixes. So I think you showed some like Excel spreadsheets.
Yes, could you read that one more time?
Yeah, where the name or the links of the sites where you were showing the tools.
Okay. For some reason, I don't know why it's not letting me go back. Oh, here we go. Okay, let me click back. So.
Yeah, I think some of these tools, like
Okay,
where
yep.
those could be found.
So all of those Excel sheets are coming from this website here. If you Google Virginia Cover Crop College 101, and then click on the first thing that comes up, or here's the link, and we will be sending out this slide so you can copy it then. But then if you go to that page, this Corn and Small Grain Management, it's a Virginia Tech page. There's a link for those resources down toward the bottom of the page. It's called Cover Crop Planting Calendar and Mix Calculator. And that's going to take you to like this spreadsheet. If you're interested in kind of these species descriptions, that is also from that Virginia resource, and it's this one down here, Virginia NRCS Cover Crop Planning Manual. So this is coming from Chris Lawrence at Virginia NRCS wrote a lot of this, and all of those different species descriptions are coming from that planning manual. Let me go forward again. That's one of the tools. There's also, oh, it must be, sorry about all of the clicking here. Let me go back. So some of the other tools I mentioned is this Managing Cover Crops Profitably, and that's a USDA SARE publication. And those have those nice tables. And then the Northeast Cover Crop Council also recently came out with a tool, and that you can find here, http://covercrop.tools/. And these will also give really nice descriptions of the different species and a lot of nice photos. If you just want to look through, if you're thinking of a cover crop you want to try out that maybe you've seen, if you just want to look through the photos and read about them.
Another question about, can most of the cover crops be grazed, used for a forage for farm animals, livestock?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so some of them, a lot of them can, some of them are less ideal for grazing. And I'm definitely not a grazing expert, but a lot of these resources, I believe this one had good grazing. So that was here. And so you could look, if you're interested in planting, say, a legume that's good for grazing, you can see that the berseem clover is excellent, and that may be a better choice than cowpeas for grazing. So some of these resources will tell you which ones may be your best choice.
Right. All right, any other questions? That's all I see, Sarah. You might want to double check your chat, but I think that's everything that was sent either to the host or the presenter.
Stop sharing. All right. Great. Well, thank you everyone for your attention.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sarah. That was an excellent presentation about cover crops. Like to thank everyone for tuning in today and logging in. We will be sending out this recording link along with Sarah's slide set. So like those links and all of that will be in the slide set. So you'll be able to have access to that. And any other questions, Sarah's contact information will be on there as well.
Take care.
All right, Sarah, thank you. I'm going to stop recording.